Today is the 11th of December, so we're going to read chapter 11 of the Christmas Mystery. This is the story of the journey of Elisabet and the other pilgrims as they make their way from Norway across Europe down towards Bethlehem, going back in time 2,000 years to the time when Jesus was born. Before we actually start the chapter, however, let's turn our attention to the Advent calendar box and see if we can learn something about the character that we'll be meeting today. So today is the 11th. Let's get that drawer out and see who it is we're going to meet. Oh, it looks like it's another one of the three kings. Well, we'll read about them and learn. But meanwhile, I'm going to put him up here with the procession of pilgrims. The 11th of December, you can see the picture there, I think, of a king of some sort mounted on horseback. Let's read about it. Many people are terribly frightened when they see one of the angels of the Lord. The rest of the afternoon was spent poring over the scraps of paper that had fallen out of the magic Advent calendar one after the other. Joachim had tried to put them in the right order so that Mama and Papa could read the story. As they read, Papa said, "That's the strangest thing I've ever seen. We must find out more about this. I wonder how many calendars like this were made." And Mama kept saying, "I've never seen anything like it. Imagine bringing home this Advent calendar, Joachim." When it was evening and Joachim had to go to bed, he sat up for a long time, staring at the calendar. Then it happened again. It had happened again. On the big calendar picture were painted many angels floating down from the sky. Joachim had seen that before, but only today did he discover that one of the angels in the picture was a cherub, just like Imperial. He was quite sure Imperial the cherub had not been in the picture until Joachim had read that he flew in spirals down from the tall church tower. "Mama!" he shouted. "Papa!" Both of them came rushing into his room. They were obviously afraid that something dreadful had happened to him. He was a bit shocked himself. "I can see the angel Imperial," was all he said. Mama and Papa turned to go back. Perhaps they thought he had been visited by an angel. But Joachim asked them to look at the picture carefully. "Can you see anything you haven't seen before?" he asked. They leaned over the picture. Papa said he might not have noticed everything when the bookseller gave them the calendar. He had been so flustered that he had left his driving license on the counter. For instance, he hadn't noticed that one of the shepherds was holding a shepherd's crook in his hand. "I don't think I'd noticed that little angel either," remarked Mama. "Of course not," said Joachim, "because he hasn't been there till now." And that's because it's a magic advent calendar. Now then, we mustn't exaggerate, objected Papa. He always liked to seem sensible. The last thing Joachim thought about before he fell asleep was that one of the angels in heaven was called Joachiel, almost the same as himself. The next morning, Joachim opened the 11th door in the Advent calendar. He had to coax the piece of paper out before he discovered a picture of a horse and a rider. He made himself comfortable under the duvet and read what was on the sheet of paper. Today he had no need to be afraid that Mama or Papa would catch him red-handed, because the secret pieces of paper in the calendar were not secret anymore. Balthazar. 5 sheep, 2 shepherds, 2 angels, 1 king of the Orient, and a little girl from Norway were speeding up the valley of the Rhine 1,199 years after Jesus was born. They could just glimpse a church tower on the other side of the river. Epheriel told them it was Mainz Cathedral. "We have to cross the river," said Joshua. "It's a pity, because we shall have to frighten another poor ferryman and explain that we're pilgrims on our way to the Holy Land." "We shall have to try to do it gently," said Epheriel. "I can see a boat down there," exclaimed Imperial. He flew high in the air, beating his short wings in the direction of the boat, with the rest of the procession after him, and started talking to a man who was sitting on the riverbank. "Can you row us across? We're going all the way to Bethlehem, and we don't have much time if we're to get there before Jesus is born. We're on a godly errand, you see, so we're not just anybody." Epheriel hurried after him. When he had caught up with Imperial, he nodded apologetically at the ferryman and said to Imperial, "How many times do I have to remind you that first of all you must say, 'Fear not'?" But the ferryman, who was unusually and splendidly dressed in a long red cloak, was not scared by the cherub. He turned to Epheriel and said, "My name is Balthazar, second wise man and King of Sheba. I'm going the same way as you." "Then you are one of us," said Epheriel. All the same, he had to give Imperial a little scolding. This time things fortunately turned out well, but you must always start by saying, "Fear not." Don't you realize that many people are terribly frightened when they see one of the angels of the Lord? At any rate, when we beat our wings. "Sorry," said Imperial. All right," replied Epherial. "But isn't it odd that they should be so frightened just because they've seen an angel?" argued Imperial. "I've never so much as harmed a cat. In fact, I couldn't count all the times I've helped a poor cat down from a tall tree. Of course, the cats ought to learn once and for all not to climb too high up in the trees. But when we do come and help them, they're not in the slightest bit frightened. It's always humans who are so terribly nervous." The 2 wise men had embraced each other. "It's been a very long time," said the one. "And it was a very, very long time from the Rhine," said the other. But it's very, very, very pleasant to see you again." They had their arms round each other, so it was not easy to say who had said what. But now the whole of the Pilgrims' procession went on board the boat. The kings of Orient each took an oar and rowed across the river, which was almost as wide as a stretch of ocean. On the other side, Epheriel pointed up to the beautiful cathedral. It seemed a little dumpy, and hadn't such a tall tower as many of the other churches they had passed, but it was much older. The year is 1186, 1186 years after Christ. Work on this cathedral began more than 200 years ago. At that time, almost 1,000 years had passed since the one seed was sown in the earth so that a field of churches and cathedrals would grow over the whole world. A whole field of churches, repeated Imperial. It would be fun to work out how many kilos of stone and timber have been used to celebrate Jesus' birth, not to mention how many cakes have been baked or how many parcels have been packed. Christmas is the world's biggest birthday party, for everybody in the whole world is invited to join in. That's why the party has lasted for so many years. Joshua struck the ground with his crook. To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. The Pilgrims hurried along the west bank of the Rhine. It was early in the morning, so that very few people would be scared when, in the course of a short second or two, they saw 5 sheep, 2 shepherds, 2 kings of Orient, 2 angels of the Lord, and a little girl dressed in clothes very different from those that were usual in the Middle Ages. When they tumbled into the town of Worms, in the year of our Lord 1162, they met a rider on horseback, a soldier who had been out on night duty perhaps. The angel Imperial flew over to the man, buzzed around him like an excited bumblebee, and repeated, "Fear not, fear not, fear not." The poor man was extremely scared. He spurred on his horse and galloped away, round some low buildings. He didn't even have time to say, "Alleluia," or "God be praised." You only need to say it once, Ethereal chided Imperial, but you must say it in a gentle, soft, heavenly voice. Fear not. You must say, it's a good idea to keep your arms down too, to show you're not carrying a weapon. Balthazar the wise man pointed up at a cathedral with 6 towers. Everywhere and at all times people have stretched their arms out to God, he said. The church towers point up to heaven too, but they last much longer. The shepherds bent their heads respectfully at these wise words, and Elisabet felt she had to repeat them to herself before she was quite certain what he meant. Joshua said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." In the city of Basel, on the southern bank of the Rhine, they stopped in front of another big cathedral. The time tells us that 1,119 years have passed since the Christ child was born, announced Ethereal. This cathedral with 5 naves has just celebrated its centenary. But for hundreds of years, Basel has been an important crossroads for travelers who have journeyed through the Alps between Italy and northern Europe. We are going to follow the same route over the St. Bernard Pass. "To Bethlehem," said Joshua the shepherd, striking his crook on the ground. "To Bethlehem." Whereupon they set off upwards through the Swiss mountains. Joachim sat in bed, thinking about the strange pilgrimage to Bethlehem. After a while, his mother and father came in to read what was on the piece of paper. "We took home a small miracle from the bookshop, didn't we, Joachim?" said Papa. "Can you imagine how it was made?" "I think John made it," said Joachim. "The bookseller said something about someone called John, didn't he?" Joachim wondered whether he ought to tell Mama and Papa that he had met John, but he didn't. he had to keep one little secret for himself, because there was something else as well. Sabet Tebas. Sabet Tebas. If this calendar was made by a flower seller, said Papa, he's certainly inventive. Mama agreed. Yes, he has plenty of imagination. You said I had a lot of imagination when I told you about Elisabet and Ethereal, he said, but I'd only read all the scraps of paper in the Advent calendar. And now we're saying that the person who made the Advent calendar has a lot of imagination, said Mama. In a way, it's the same. Joachim shook his head. He may not have so much imagination if the whole story is true. Papa laughed. You surely don't think you really can run all the way to Bethlehem and far back in time as well. Nothing is impossible for God, said Joachim. Nobody protested. Papa thought they ought to get hold of a large atlas so that they could follow Elisabet's journey on the map. He had a historical atlas, too, a book of maps that showed what all the countries and all the places were called in the olden days. The same country and the same town have often had different names, he explained. Suddenly, Mama gave a little gasp. Do you remember that old story from way back, she said to Papa? There really was a little girl who disappeared from this town while she and her mother were out doing their Christmas shopping. I think she was called Elisabet. Papa nodded. It was some time after the war. Was she called Elisabet? I think so, said Mama, but I'm not sure. Suddenly, it was as if Mama and Papa had forgotten Joachim. They were so busy talking to each other. So maybe he's remembered that old story and made up the rest himself, suggested Papa. If it is this flower seller who's made it, can you find out whether she was called Elisabet? Said Joachim. Yes, I should think so, replied Papa. Not that it really matters what she was called. The last person to say anything before they had to hurry to eat breakfast was Joachim. I think it matters a lot, he said, because the lady in the photo was called Elisabet too. Things are getting increasingly mysterious in the Christmas mystery. And that's the end of chapter 11. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 12.